Once you've figured out which translation of the Bible you want to read from and you understand a little bit about the different types of books in the Bible, the next question is, how do I start reading the Bible? And I suppose in some ways you could read it like any other book from beginning to end. It is a historical book from Genesis to Esther at least, although Kings and Chronicles kind of overlap. But then you get into some poetry and some prophets and it gets pretty confusing. You might also get stuck in a section like in the books of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, with a whole bunch of sacrifices and explaining where to cut in the animal and lists of names, and you might get stuck there. I speak to so many people who say when they read the Bible they just open somewhere and start reading, and it's great that you're reading the Bible, but it's probably the hardest way, the most difficult way to read the Bible. We don't read any book like that. We don't just open it up and start reading somewhere, because there's going to be no context for what we're reading. Not going to know why we're reading what we're reading. And so I think the best way to read the Bible is to pick a book and read it from beginning to end. A great place to start is in the Gospels. The Bible is all about Jesus Christ, and the Gospels record his life and the events and teachings of his life. So it's a great place to start. Mark is written by a young man, so it's like an action gospel. There's no frills or fuss about it. He just gives the details, the really important stuff. John, his gospel, he writes when he's an old man, and so it contains quite a lot of reflections, and it's probably the most reflective, sort of mystical book of the Gospels in terms of reflecting on the life of Jesus and what it really meant. Both Luke and Matthew are a little bit more technical. Matthew is written for a Jewish audience, and so it's got a lot of references to the Old Testament and to genealogies, which were important to that audience. And then Luke is a doctor, so you know how doctors can be. It's a little bit more technical, but all of them make for great reading. After the Gospels, you've got Acts, which is also written by Luke and is actually a 30-year account of the early church and the events of the early church. I think the first time I read that book, I found it absolutely riveting, and I couldn't put it down. After Acts, you get the epistles, or the letters to the different churches. And so these are written by different men, but they're always written into the events of those churches. And in them, the writers deal with a whole bunch of really important subjects that make for great reading. These definitely need to be read from beginning to end if you want to understand them. The book of Romans and Hebrews are probably your most theologically intense letters, and so those are going to take a bit more work to understand, but it's well worth the effort. In the Old Testament, from Genesis through to Esther, you've got the historical books, and sure, there's passages where there's a whole bunch of lists of names or different sacrifices and laws, but by and large it's just a great account of God dealing with people and interacting with their lives. I've always loved reading the historical books. The account of Joseph from Genesis 37 to 50 has been one of my absolute favorites, but anywhere in there is great. Really makes for really great reading. After the historical books, you've got the Psalms and the Proverbs, and this is the one place in Scripture you can just open up and read a full psalm or a proverb by itself, because they are bite-sized chunks of truth. So often when I've got 5 minutes or 2 minutes to spare and I want to just have a little read of the Bible, I go to a psalm or a proverb. So that's how you start reading the Bible. I really recommend you start with the Gospels and then Acts, and read those books from beginning to end. And after that, take your pick of Old Testament historical books or New Testament letters to the churches, or even from the Psalms or Proverbs, because all of them are going to deepen your understanding of who God is and deepen your understanding of the way we relate to Him and how to live this life for Him.